Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
Many might be wondering, how did it come?
Did NATO betray Russia? Let's see.
Yeah, I'll react to that, sure.
You will? Thanks, man. That was my other video, guys. Okay, let's find out. Preemptive, like, open mind. Obviously, the war going on. But let's push that aside. Nobody is here trying to leave your morality outside. As bad as that sounds, I think that's crucial to finding facts and learning. Let's go.
Many might be wondering, how did it come to this? How, even after the USSR fell, did Russia go down such a different path than NATO? Was there ever perhaps some possibility that these two rivals after the end of the Cold War would have came together in peace? Because apparently Putin seems to think so, or at least he says so. His current track record with the truth isn't the best, by the way.
You really think someone would do that?
Putin says Russia wanted to join NATO, but NATO didn't let them. Is there truth to this?
What do you mean,
The answer to why Russia didn't join NATO is a story about a former superpower rebuilding itself from the ground up. How Russia, or at least the Duma and Putin, viewed their status in regards to the West. So first, the question we're all asking. When it comes to this whole situation, who's to blame for this? It's Putin. 100%. This was all Putin. Even if NATO had done some bad things, even if Russia had some fair points about their expansion, even if NATO took over Ukraine, like Putin says, you still can't invade others. Like, it was bad when the US did it in Iraq. It's even worse when Putin does it now.
Okay.
1991, the fall of the USSR. Russia is...
Keep my wife's name out your...
1991, the fall of the USSR. Russia is weak and wants assurance from the US and NATO that they wouldn't spread east of Germany. Eastern Europe could be like a neutral ground, and the United States informally agreed.
Hey.
Or, well, George H.W. Bush agreed. Verbally.
Bar. We can't show any weakness in front of the Russians.
This was never an actual written agreement. It was just an understanding.
Why is it that the American figurine always has sunglasses? Is that like a Joe Biden reference?
This was never an actual written agreement. It was just an understanding. Oh, also, I was lying. This agreement wasn't made with Russia after the fall of the USSR, but before, with Gorbachev. The importance of this agreement really depends on who you ask. For avid Russian supporters, this was a legitimate, sometimes legal agreement that NATO promised and then broke. For NATO, their promise not to move east was an informal verbal agreement that doesn't matter. Throughout the last century, there have been multiple discussions between NATO and the Russians over their relationship with NATO. The first one, at least of note, was in 1990, where the United States agreed not to move east into East Germany after the fall of the Berlin Wall. The USSR, though weakened, was still a prominent power, and NATO verbally agreed that they would never move in to Germany. And then the Soviets collapsed. Now, when talking about how important these promises were to the Soviets, we will never really know. Even Gorbachev flip-flops on how important these assurances actually were. What's more interesting is the constant
First issue.
Germany. And then the
is that okay? There was an informal, verbal, and informal agreement, which doesn't mean nothing. Okay. Obviously, it doesn't mean as much as a written agreement, but it's a formal, verbal agreement between two powers, which should carry some weight. But the problem is that, yeah, we said we wouldn't go into East Germany, like even after the wall collapsed. But then the Soviet Union collapsed. So now, like, all bets are sort of off because you are no longer the Soviet Union. You're the Russian Federation. You're Russia now, and you clearly will not have the ability to run or secure some sort of order or economic prosperity, minimal. And so now, of course, it's going to be much harder to do that when you have a bunch of countries that are kind of fed up with your influence and want to go towards more the U.S. side of influence. And at that point, that's kind of like the verbal agreement means much less.
Soviets.
If I'm understanding things correctly. So that's the first bad thing on Russia, is that you can't claim that that verbal agreement means that now they're encroaching. Well, you collapsed, and those Eastern nations, obviously including West Germany, need to be, or East Germany, are going to want to look elsewhere for support. And you can't just be like, no, our crappy Russian government in 1990 or 1991 will still take care of them, and that agreement should stay in place, and that's ridiculous.
Collapse.
I hope I'm
now, when
understanding.
talking about how important these promises were to the Soviets, we will never really know. Even Gorbachev flip-flops on how important these assurances actually were. What's more interesting is the constant mention of the CSCE. Never heard of it? It's because it never really panned out like it was truly planned. Whether or not any of this was true or just bluster, this talk of a united umbrella was seen as a viable possibility in the early 90s, before the USSR even fell. This is what Gorbachev and the Russians heard. Russia, at least if the Soviets fell, would be joining a united Europe. And then Clinton was elected. It's 1992, baby. The Soviets are dead. Bush, despite overseeing the fall of the Soviet Union and bombing Saddam's forces back into Iraq, still promised to not raise taxes.
Read my lip.
And then he raised taxes. So he was voted out. NATO was seen as a relic of an age that no longer existed. It was an active discussion in the 90s what the fate of NATO.
I
so
missed
he was
that.
Read my lip.
So there was I missed that. I wasn't even alive. Was I alive when Bush 1 was president? No, I was born in 93. So Clinton, I was born during the early times of Clinton's first term. And like stuff like that, if you said read my lips, no new taxes, and then you raise taxes, I feel like stuff is so polarized that it's like this makes me realize there was a time when politics was less polarized than it was now. Because people actually said, all right, I'll vote for the other side since you broke that promise. And that's sad for me. Politics sucks nowadays. I just don't even care. I don't care. I don't care. It's all a bunch of bull crap. Nobody wants to think about what might be right. Everyone is just concerned about protecting the integrity of their side and doing whatever they can to undermine the other side. There is I call it sports teams politics.
And
That's my term, trademark.
then he raised taxes. So he was voted out. NATO was seen as a relic of an age that no longer existed. It was an active discussion in the 90s what the fate of NATO should even be. It was a stringently anti-communist alliance that no longer had a communism to fight, and yet NATO stayed. Now, let me take out this big ol' button. I should iterate.
He should not have to say that, but unfortunately people are so damn jumpy that if I say anything, look, I do not like Russia. I hate communism, okay? I didn't like the Soviet Union. I wasn't around during the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union looked terrible. I think China looks terrible. The U.S. is terrible in a lot of ways, but I prefer how we do it. And so, look, I'm not sympathizing Putin over Ukraine. That shouldn't even have to be said. But he has to do it, and I have to do it. And it's sad. I like to talk about controversial subjects without having to preeminent. Guys, I understand this is all bad. It's like people should be less jumpy to call someone a bigot and more willing to listen without having to be told, don't worry, I'm not saying this. But yeah, that's necessary. I'm getting mad.
I should iterate that the Russians are not simply victims in this. For Central Europe, nations like Poland, Hungary, Romania, and even other nations like the Baltic states were living under Soviet control for decades. As soon as the Warsaw Pact fell, there was a real homegrown movement to join NATO, or at least get some protection from the West in case anything happened again. Would anything happen again? Who knows? The West didn't know, the Russians didn't know, and this was kind of the basis of Clinton sort of keeping NATO around. We're into 1993. Russia is slowly rebuilding, with a few
That's when I was born.
hiccups along the way. Clinton comes to Boris Yeltsin with a proposal, a partnership for peace. All of Europe now coming together. Nobody would need to expand NATO if we all were just in this partnership together. And then Clinton drops the bombshell on Yeltsin. This whole partnership for peace was not an alternative to the expansion of NATO. It was a preparation for it. To which Yeltsin replied, why? NATO was created in Cold War times. Today it's trying to find its place in Europe, not without difficulty. It's important that this search not create new divisions, but promote European unity. We believe that the plans of expanding NATO are contrary to this logic. Why sow the seeds of distrust? After all, we're no longer adversaries. We are partners. Yet the plans continued. Poland, Hungary, and Czechia soon joined.
Guys, you can't say that that was good, okay? NATO was wrong there. Russia might have been right there. Deal with the fact that I just said that. It doesn't mean what they're doing now is good, but NATO is not without blame.
Join NATO. Yet, this wasn't the breaking point in relations. Russia still remained a part of the NATO cooperation sphere. There was an optimistic view that the kinks in this whole thing were slowly being worked out. Now, keep in mind, this whole time, NATO is entirely justified in what they're doing. They're technically not doing anything wrong. But from the Russian mindset, going from a communist superpower to a mafia state, where this man is their leader, well, they felt nothing but shame. That fear and paranoia only began to grow, and it became manifested when this guy came to power. But even with Putin in office, and him winning the presidency through some zany means, Russia was still somewhat friendly with the US, yet that was going to change. In 2004, NATO, under Bush's push, brought in 7 new nations. Now, once again, if these nations wanted to join NATO, that's fine. But after a decade of this, Russia became paranoid that NATO was simply out to get them. And then Bush welcomes in these nations as escaping an evil empire.
Countries should be able to decide their own treaties. That being said, if you're Russia, wouldn't you be paranoid as well? Alright, I'm done defending them. I just like to do it because you guys hate it. This is Hello? Did you hear? What did I just do? Okay, hold on. I guess... Okay, never mind. Putin's an idiot. Now, can you give me it back? That worked? Jesus?
The door to NATO will remain open until the whole of Europe is united in freedom and in peace.
You can even go back to articles in 2004 where people say Russia is going to change their foreign policy. The Russian Duma began freaking out, and the first man they ran to was a violent Putin. Georgia was invaded 4 years later. Keep in mind when I say Russians, I don't mean all Russians. I mean the Russian government, which should usually be clear, but I just know some of you are gonna try to use that as a gotcha. One question may be on your mind. After the Cold War, why didn't the Russians just join NATO if they were so afraid of it? General opposition to the West, for one. Russia, even while the USSR was collapsing, didn't want to view this as a defeat. They wanted to view this as a new age. Then it turns out
We're both just changing, right? This isn't a collapse.
to view this as a defeat. They wanted to view this as a new
Yeah, sure.
age. Then it turns out only their institutions fell. But there's also another reason why Russia didn't join. NATO is not simply an alliance, it's a structured machine. When a nation joins NATO, it is not simply changing to the blue team. The way its military is organized becomes based around being able to work within that machine. A country joining NATO is a process that takes years. This isn't a process that simply happens. For one, a nation joining NATO has to be unanimously accepted by everyone. And it also has to be voted on by that nation's population. As an example, Hungary in 1997 voted 85% in favor of joining. Would the Russian people ever have accepted to join an organization that
I feel like they would only...
they believed was an arm of the American empire?
Right, which I guess it is kind of. The reason I think that that's sort of is that there's no way America would join a defense alliance like NATO, a treaty organization like NATO, if it meant they had to give up a lot of their military autonomy, which is what countries usually have to do. But America doesn't really have to do that because it already has an enormous army that dominates NATO. And Russia is probably thinking, or I would think if I'm the U.S., ooh, I like being like the top dog in NATO, like by far. And if Russia comes in, even though they did collapse, then I might not have full control over everyone in NATO. I know that you can what's the word? It's just that like America can still go around the world and do whatever it wants militarily and still be in NATO, where it seems like if you're not as wealthy of a country, big of a country, as military capable of a country, you're really ceding your military autonomy to other powers in a way. Even though, yes, you have a lot of vetoes and all this stuff. I get it. But, yeah, if I'm Russia, I'll be like, okay, so we lost and everything, and now I'm going to have my military is going to have to be controlled by the U.S.?
The rule of geopolitics is the fire.
Run away now.
The rule of geopolitics is the closer you are to a superpower, the more they mingle and try to control your nation. And that's what Russia really views a lot of their neighbors as, just pawns on a board for which they, as the stronger nation, have the right to control. Their goals in Europe simply drive others away from them. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. NATO expansion closer to Russia only made them more paranoid and isolated. However, if NATO didn't expand, who's to say what countries like Estonia might find themselves in right now? It's clear Putin has some fantasy about rebuilding the Russian Empire, or at least the influence of the USSR. This video is not about two equally bad camps. NATO's greatest sin, at least in this regard, is leaving its doors wide open. It's been said that Americans should imagine what it'd be like if Canada fell to Chinese influence.
Right. I think that's a good thing.
Complaining that your geopolitical rival lied about letting your former allies into their compass club doesn't make you look like a victim. Nobody would feel sorry for the United States if China took Canada. They would laugh.
Exactly. And then the U.S. would pull out its guns and then invade Canada. That's what would happen. I know America loves to think this is an illness that has learning about history. Every freaking big power is like they're all hunky-dory and everything when everything goes their way and like, oh, I'm the good guy and God, look at how evil over here. But if you mess with the USA's direct interest, like oil in the Middle East or a close neighbor as a threat like Canada or Mexico, Cuba, then they're going to put that facade down and start shooting things. That's just what happens. And that's why I just hate to think that, yeah, NATO countries, I think, are morally better than Russia. But I hate the good guy, bad guy dichotomy.
Oh wait, actually we don't need a hypothetical. The same situation happened with the US too, with Cuba. And we know how the US would react when a neighbor turns to the enemy side. Keep them sanctioned for decades, which, here's a little tip, is a bad thing to do too. Whataboutism is used a lot by pro-Putin supporters, bringing up every transgression the US has ever done. And it's true.
I hate that term. I despise that term. Whataboutism. What do you mean, whataboutism? So I can't. And usually the people who say, oh, that's whataboutism, will, in the next conversation where they're being argued against, what about? It's like, of course, whataboutisms are part of arguments. How can you say, oh, yeah, this, someone, and then you say, well, what about when this, and them saying, oh, whataboutism, that's not allowed in the rules. I think whataboutisms are fine as long as you don't not answer their question. But man, I hate it if you're trying to bring up an analogy to like use and someone says whataboutism. Oh, it infuriates me. Why am I in such a nasty mood right now? Sorry.
And supporters bringing up every
It's because I'm just foreseeing in the future the Discord comments, and I'm furious.
Transgression the US has ever done. And it's true the United States has done a lot of bad things. Iraq, for instance, that was bad. It's funny it's being used as an equivalent because people in the West at the time protested the war without disappearing. The closest the US had to censoring opposition to the Iraq war was when the country industry killed off the Dixie Chick's career. Can Russians today say the same thing? Or are they not even allowed to call this a war but a military operation? That said, we should be asking some questions to ourselves. Did NATO still need to exist after the Soviets fell? Did NATO existing push Russia towards a nationalistic paranoia in its reforming years that undermined the same liberal democracy that the West was trying to plant within the country? Was NATO obligated to give Russia the shit towards a nationalist? Be asking some questions to ourselves. Did NATO still need to exist after the Soviets fell?
I think it was a good idea that it kept existing. Did it need to? I mean, I guess not, but I think it was a good idea.
Did NATO existing push Russia towards a nationalistic paranoia in its reforming years?
Yes. But they still would have been, I think anything I learned about Russia is that in any century is that they're not exactly the most tolerant, good society. And so I still think that they would have descended into a bad structure or country and maybe tried to expand. But I think that's undoubtful that they got more paranoid with NATO expansion. But you can't blame countries for trying to join NATO. That's their option.
That undermined the same Was NATO obligated to give Russian interests the time of day? Do geopolitics even work like that? For my personal opinion, I believe that the Russians had far different expectations for what a post-Soviet world would look like. The Russians believed, in part because of those 1990 talks involving East Germany, that with the end of the Warsaw Pact, NATO wouldn't expand. That instead there would be some coalition in Europe where Russia has special privileges. While to the Americans, they took the fall of the USSR as a victory. Their promises to the Soviets were when the Warsaw Pact still existed. With the collapse, the Americans now oversaw a Central and Eastern Europe that was eager to join in the economic prosperity of the West.
And yeah, that's a big notch point where you can't expect all of these countries to not want to get away from you when you've collapsed and didn't treat them that well before.
It was a
Just look at capitalist countries. And I want
complicated act balancing these nations while also trying to not exclude the Russians. A Europe that Russia claimed it wanted to be in. Yet Russia only became more and more isolated. While much of this discussion is around NATO, this is simply one element. NATO, up until recently,
seems like Russia had a delusional belief that if they join NATO, that like they shouldn't be seen as just like a Lithuania, but they should be seen as like a co-ruler with the US. And so I'm sure they wouldn't have liked being just forced into this very mediocre role within NATO. I don't think that would have lasted very long.
Events didn't
And the fact that Russia is just so ideologically different.
actually move their military equipment past those original 1991 borders. The main issue the Russian government has isn't just a military bloc, but Western institutions. Or at least institutions that don't serve their interess. If Putin wasn't blaming NATO, the problem would be something else. Like, I don't know, the whole thing that started this in the first place. Like Ukrainians wanting to join the European Union. Putin's Russia really has been their own worst enemy for a while, as every hostile action, every threat, every influence, every corrupt politician has only made their former allies turn against them. It's always good to try to see from all perspectives, yet not all perspectives are equal. Sometimes the perspective is simply that another nation was a mistake to exist. Sometimes it's that the collapse of the simply that another nation.
Putin blames all Ukrainian self-assertion in the modern era on a foreign intrigue. First, the desire of the leaders of the Polish national movement to exploit the Ukrainian issue to their own advantage, and then how the Austro-Hungarian authorities latched onto this narrative to harm Russia.
Was a mistake to exist. Sometimes it's that the collapse of the USSR was the most catastrophic event of the 20th century. Even if there was a kernel of truth to the idea that NATO misled the Russians, it does not justify their actions. Should Putin really be talking about how misleading is bad? Kind of seems like...
If anything, it proves the point that you shouldn't have been NATO in the first place.
Should Putin really be talking about how misleading is bad? Kind of seems like that was their strategy for the last few months. NATO is not a perfect organization. However, if the nations of Europe want to join this club, it should always be their right. Russia expected the continent to remain a neutral ground for their own interests, even after their pact...
Like, if the U.S. was invading Ukraine in order to establish a pro-NATO government, then sure, maybe you have a point, but if they want to vote as a country to come in, then F off.
Collapsed. And when that didn't happen, they claimed no fair. You do not start wars over verbal agreements that happened before most of your troops were even born. We cannot forget that this all is coming down to
And that happened when you were a world power.
Real war within a split nation. A war that, while true, has been raging for 8 years, only began because the Russian side didn't have their guy in charge anymore. One that escalated into an invasion of an independent nation, which regardless of the justification, only justifies the fear, which
Azov Battalion, neo-Nazis, defeating Globo Homo,
of the
beating Western influence. Actually, they were making nukes.
justification.
Genocide against Russians. Rightful Russian claim. We're superpower number one.
Only justifies the fears of Russia's enemies. So, yeah. Congrats, Putin. You were the monster that proved NATO was right to
Good
build
job,
up.
dude.
While this alliance didn't know what it was going to be in the mid-90s, it sure does know now. You didn't want to be a part of Europe, and now you get your wish.
Why didn't they just... Like, Russia wouldn't... Like, if Russia would just adapt more Western ways, I think it would be a pretty decent and formidable country. But I think that its old communist ideologies with its corrupt oligarchs and government and people like Putin holding the country back and from a more happy existence, in my opinion. Awesome video, guys. Thanks for tuning in, watching this great video from this great channel. And I'll see you guys next time. Alternate History Hub. Bye, guys.